On the phone. Mr. Hornbuckle, good morning to you, sir. Thanks for your time this morning.
This is an NBC News special report. Here's Lester Holt.
Good morning, everyone. We're coming on the air with live coverage of testimony by Dr. Anthony Fauci before the Senate Health Committee. Status of the coronavirus epidemic, which so far has claimed more than 81,000 lives in this country. Dr. Fauci is expected to offer a stark warning on the dangers of reopening the country too quickly. Something he told the New York Times last night could lead to, quote, needless suffering and death. That's a contrast to the much more optimistic language we've been hearing from President Trump as recently as his news conference of yesterday. Also testifying today, the director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, Dr. Robert Redfield, FDA Commissioner Dr. Stephen Hahn, and Health and Human Services Assistant Secretary Dr. Giroir. And this will be a hearing unlike any we have seen, with all four witnesses and many members of the Senate committee itself appearing remotely by video conference, Zoom, a precaution that has become all too familiar in this pandemic. As we await the hearing, let's go right now. This is Chairman Lamar Alexander.
And get tested. Our Governor, Bill Lee, is also testing every prisoner, every resident and staff member in a nursing home. He's offered weekend drive-through testing. He's done specific outreach for testing to low-income communities. A Tennessean can get a free test at the local public health department. The governor's slogan is, if in doubt, get a test. Governor Lee sent his testing goals in May to the federal government, as every state has done. Federal government is helping him make sure that he has enough supplies in case he has trouble getting them through the labs and the other commercial sources. As a result, our state has tested about 4% of the population. The governor hopes to increase that by 7% in May. That's one of the best in the country. This impressive level of testing is sufficient, we believe, to begin phase one of going back to work. But as I said last week, it's not nearly enough to provide confidence to 31,000 students and faculty members who we hope will show up at the University of Tennessee campus in August when school starts. Last week, I talked with UT Knoxville Chancellor Dondi Plowman about that. We said, what would persuade those 31,000 students, as well as the 50 million K through 12 students in the country and the other 5,000 university students, what will persuade them to go back to campus in August? That's where the new Shark Tank comes in. Dr. Collins at the National Institutes of Health calls it RADx. We had our hearing about that on Thursday. It's a really remarkable scientific exercise to take a few early stage concepts that are swimming around in what we call that competitive Shark Tank and see if Dr. Collins and his associates can find a few new technologies to create millions of new tests that will scale up rapidly and make it more likely that students will go back to school in August. For example, the FDA authorized last week its first diagnostic test using saliva that a person provides at home instead of a nose swab or blood. It authorized its first antigen test. We're hearing a lot about those, like the ones used for flu or strep throat, which involves the swabbing of a nose, and you can get the result in just a few minutes. Another proposal, not yet approved, is to put in your mouth a sort of lollipop sponge. Take a photo of that with your cell phone and send that to your doctor. If it lights up, you're positive. Or the university might send that saliva lollipop to a nearby laboratory, which could be a gene sequencing laboratory, which can deal with thousands of those samples overnight. That same process could occur at a middle school. It could occur at a factory. Of course, anyone testing negative one day can test positive the next, but such widespread screening of entire campuses, schools, or places of work will help identify those who are sick, trace down those who are exposed, and that in turn should help persuade the rest of us to go back to school and back to work. In addition to more testing, I expect Dr. Fauci talked to us about additional treatments that will be available to reduce the risk of death, and the administration's plan to do something that our country's never done before, which is to start manufacturing a vaccine before it actually has been proven to work in order to speed up the result in case it does work. Those vaccines, those treatments are the ultimate solution. But until we have them, all roads back to work and school go through testing. The more tests we conduct, the better we can identify those who are sick and exposed. Then we can quarantine the sick and exposed instead of trying to quarantine the whole country. Now, in my opinion, this will require millions of new tests, many from new technologies. Some of these will fail, but we only need a few successes to get where we want to go. That's why I said on Thursday that what our country had done so far in testing is impressive, but not nearly enough. First, squeeze all the tests we can out of current technologies. Next, try to find new technologies to help us contain the disease and persuade us to go back to work. Now, one other thing. This is a bipartisan hearing to examine how well we're preparing to go safely back to work and to school, and to determine what else we need to do in the United States Senate. Such an exercise sometimes encourages finger pointing. Before we spend too much time finger pointing, I'd like to suggest that almost all of us, the United States and almost every country, so far as I can tell, underestimated this virus, underestimated how contagious it would be, underestimated how it can travel silently in people without symptoms to infect other people, how it can be especially deadly for certain segments of our population, the elderly, those with pre-existing conditions, minority populations. Let me go back to the March 3rd hearing that we had in our committee on coronavirus, 6 weeks after the first case was discovered in the United States, a day when only 2 deaths were recorded in this country. I read at that hearing this paragraph from the New York Times 2 days earlier on March the 1st. They reported this: much about the coronavirus remains unclear, the Times reported, and it's far from certain, this is March 3rd, March 1, that the outbreak will reach severe proportions in the United States or affect many regions at once. With its top-notch scientists, modern hospitals, and sprawling public health infrastructure, most experts agree the United States is among the countries best prepared to prevent or manage such an epidemic. That was the New York Times on March 1. A lot of effort has gone into trying to make our country well prepared. Over the last 20 years, 4 presidents, several Congresses, in response to 9/11, bird flu, Katrina, Ebola, H1N1, MERS, passed 9 major laws to try to help get this country ready for what we're going through today. These laws stood up the Strategic National Stockpile, created an Assistant Secretary for Preparedness. It created incentives for the developments of vaccines and medicines that we're using today, strengthened the Centers for Disease Control, created BARDA, thanks to the leadership of Senator Blunt and Senator Murray for 5 straight years. We've significantly increased funding for the National Institutes of Health. All this was part of a shared goal. Democrats, Republicans, 4 presidents, several Congresses, to try to get ready for what we're going through today, whether it was known like anthrax or unknown like COVID-19. But despite all that effort, even the experts underestimated COVID-19. This hearing is about how we improve our response to this virus as well as the next one. During the oversight hearing, I also intend to focus on, as I just said, the next pandemic, which we know is coming. What can we learn from this one to be ready for the next one? What can we learn from the fast tracking of vaccines and treatments that we're about to hear about that will make it even faster the next time? How can we keep hospitals and states from selling off protective equipment when their budget gets tight? How can we make sure Congress does our share of the funding responsibility? How do we provide enough extra hospital beds without canceling elective surgery, hurting other patients, and bankrupting hospitals? Whose job should it be to coordinate supply lines so that protective equipment and supplies get where they're supposed to go when they're supposed to go? What's the best way to manage the stockpile? My preacher once said, "I'm not worried about what you do on Sunday. It's the rest of the week that concerns me." I'm afraid that during the rest of the week between pandemics, we relax our focus on preparedness. We become preoccupied with other important things. Our collective memory is short. Just 3 months ago, this country was preoccupied with impeaching a president. Now that seems like ancient Roman history. Now, while this crisis has our full attention, I believe we should put into law this year whatever improvements need to be made to be well prepared for the next pandemic. If there is to be finger pointing, hope they're pointed in that direction. We're fortunate today to have 4 distinguished witnesses who are at the heart of the response to the coronavirus. We're grateful for their service to our country. I've asked them each to summarize their remarks in 5 minutes. Then we'll have 5-minute round of questions from each senator. I've agreed we'll end our hearing about 12:30 after we have a full round of questions. Every senator will have a chance to have his or her 5 minutes. Senator Murray will then have an opportunity to ask the last question or to close the hearing, and I will then close the hearing. There will be other hearings to follow this hearing, like last Thursday's hearing, and senators may submit their questions in writing within the next 10 days. Staying at home indefinitely is not the solution to this pandemic. There's not enough money available to help all those hurt by a closed economy. All roads back to work and back to school lead through testing, tracking, isolation, treatment, and vaccines. This requires widespread testing. Millions more tests, created mostly by new technologies, to identify those who are sick and who've been exposed so they can be quarantined, and by containing the disease in this way, give the rest of America enough confidence to go back to work and school. For the near term, help make sure those 31,000 UT students and faculty members show up in August. We need widespread testing. Millions more tests, created mostly by new technologies, to identify those who are sick and who have been exposed so they can be quarantined. By containing the disease in this way, give the rest of America enough confidence to go back to work and back to school. Senator Murray.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My thoughts are with you and your team right now as you try to navigate the same challenge so many in our country are worried about. We all wish your staff member a speedy recovery. And as everyone works to take appropriate safety precautions today, I'd like to thank not only our witnesses for joining us today, but also our committee staff for working to set up a safe format for members and witnesses and the public to participate in this hearing remotely. Families across the country are counting on us for the truth about the COVID-19 pandemic, especially since it is clear they will not get it from President Trump. Truth is essential, so people have the facts, so they can make decisions for themselves and their families and their communities. Lives are at stake. If the president isn't telling the truth, we must, and our witnesses must, and we're counting on you today. And families need us to take this opportunity to dig into the facts about where things did go wrong so we can finally get them on track. Because the Trump administration's response to this public health emergency so far has been a disaster all on its own. Delays, missteps have put us way behind where we need to be on diagnostic tests and allowed inaccurate antibody tests to flood the market. Corruption and political interference have impeded efforts to secure desperately needed personal protective equipment and promoted dangerous, unproven treatments. And we recently learned that after experts at the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention spent weeks developing a detailed guide to help our communities understand how to safely reopen when the time comes, the Trump administration tossed it in the trash bin for being too prescriptive. But this is far from the first time this administration has silenced experts who were doing their job and putting public health first. The fact of the matter is, President Trump has been more focused on fighting against the truth than fighting this virus. and Americans have sadly paid the price. Since this committee last heard from these witnesses on March 3rd, we have seen over 900 deaths in my home state of Washington, over 80,000 deaths nationally, and the numbers continue to climb. Still, President Trump is trying to ignore the facts and ignore the experts who've been very clear we are nowhere close to where we need to be to reopen safely. My hope today is that we can cut through this and have a serious discussion about what is needed to safely open, how close we are as a country to meeting those needs, and how we actually get there. One thing that's abundantly clear, we need dramatically more testing. It is unacceptable we still don't have a national strategic plan to make sure testing is free, fast, and everywhere. That is why I fought to make sure our last COVID-19 package included an initial $25 billion testing fund and a requirement that the administration submit a plan by May 24th. And when I say a plan, I don't mean a PR plan. I mean a plan with specific timelines and numeric goals for supply and funding needs, one that actually addresses the issues we're seeing on testing capacity and distribution and disparities and building out our public health system, and makes clear to states and tribes and employers and the American people what they can expect and what the administration will do to keep Americans safe. But testing alone won't be enough to reopen our country. We still need far more personal protective equipment that has been available for our healthcare workers on the front lines. And we will need far more for other workers as we reopen. So we desperately need this administration to step up and get that equipment to states who are doing everything in their power to purchase supplies, but simply cannot get nearly enough. Because the reality is, unlike states, the federal government has the tools to actually fix the problem, if only the administration would use them. And we also need that equipment to actually work, and for the FDA to act promptly if it does not weeks later when people may have already been exposed. And just as importantly, we can't expect people to go back to work or to restaurants or to confidently send their kids to school if there isn't clear, detailed guidance about how to do that safely. Schools, from early childhood through college, need to know how to keep their students, their staff, and their educators safe. When should they wear masks? How do you run a school cafeteria or a school bus? And if they can't reopen classrooms, schools and families need to know we are working to ensure every student gets an education. Tools like online learning can only get us so far if we don't address the digital divide so that every student can access them. And even then, there will be learning loss that could deepen existing educational disparities among low-income students, students with disabilities, English language learners, and other vulnerable populations if we don't make sure they get equal access to resources and support. And of course, schools aren't the only workplaces we've got to be thinking about. We need to make sure that industries across the country know how to safely reopen and that people know their workplace is safe. Secretary Scalia needs to stop dragging his feet and do his job and have the Department of Labor set forward a rule that makes clear worker safety is not optional. Mr. Chairman, I hope this committee can hear about those critical issues from Secretary Scalia and Secretary DeVos, as well as other experts in the space in the days ahead. And this is especially important to protect workers and residents at our nursing homes and other congregate care facilities, where we've seen some of the most deadly outbreaks. And as the rash of outbreaks at meatpacking plants shows, this isn't just an issue for the healthcare industry, it is an issue for everyone. And just as we need a plan before we can start to reopen, we also need a plan well before we have a safe and effective vaccine to guarantee that we can quickly produce and distribute it on a global scale and make it free and available for everyone. So I'll be asking about our progress on those issues today. Today, safely reopening our country may be a ways off, and the administration's planning may be way behind. But there's still a lot that Congress needs to do. There isn't time to spare. Some, including the White House, say we've already provided enough economic relief. Well, my question to them is, what good is a bridge that only gets you to the middle of the river? We don't need to wait around to see if people need more help. We know they do. We need to work quickly on another aggressive relief package, and we need to make sure our priorities in that bill are protecting our workers, our students, and our families, and addressing this public health crisis, not bailing out corporations or protecting big business from accountability. People across the country are doing their part. They are washing their hands and wearing masks and social distancing and staying home. They need their government to do its part too. They need leadership. They need a plan. They need honesty, and they need it now before we reopen, so they can rest assured that we are doing things safely and competently with their health and well-being as a top priority. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
This hearing, it's an important hearing, and I know lots of people may be watching it for the first time. If they are, I hope they notice that we have 23 members of this committee, I believe, one more Republican than Democrat. We have some very strong views, but we're able to work together and to express those views and respect each other and our witnesses. And a big part of that goes to Senator Murray and her staff. So thank you for that. Each witness will have up to 5 minutes to give his testimony. Thank you for making an exception and agreeing to testify by video because of these unusual circumstances. And thank you for what you're doing for our country. Our first witness is Dr. Anthony Fauci. He's director of the National Institutes of Allergy and Infectious Diseases at the National Institutes of Health. He's held that position since 1984, which meant he's advised 6 presidents and worked on HIV, AIDS, influenza, malaria, Ebola, and other infectious diseases. He was involved in treating Ebola patients at NIH and also worked on vaccine trials for Ebola. Next, we'll hear from Dr. Robert Redfield. He's director of the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, which has its headquarters in Atlanta. More than 30 years, he's been involved with clinical research related to chronic human viral infections and infectious diseases, especially HIV. He was the founding director of the Department of Retroviral Research within the U.S. military's HIV research program. He spent 20 years with the U.S. Army Medical Corps. Third, Admiral Giroir. Admiral Giroir is Assistant Secretary for Health at the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. That puts him in charge of development of public health policy recommendations. He's taken on the responsibility for coordinating testing and focused on the increasing number of tests that we can do with existing technology. His federal service includes a variety of activities with our Defense Department in advanced research, threat reduction. He was part of the Blue Ribbon panel to reform the U.S. veterans health system. And finally, we'll hear from Dr. Stephen Hahn. He's commissioner of the Food and Drug Administration. Before joining FDA, he was the chief medical executive of the University of Texas MD Anderson Cancer Center. He was chair of the Department of Radiation Oncology at the University of Pennsylvania. He was a senior investigator at the National Institutes of Health. He was commander of the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps in 2025. Now we'll ask each of our witnesses to summarize their remarks in 5 minutes. Following that, each senator will have 5 minutes for questions and answers in order of seniority. Dr. Fauci, let's begin with you. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Murray, and members of the committee. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to discuss with you today the role of the National Institutes of Health in research addressing COVID-19. The strategic plan that we have is fourfold. One, to improve our fundamental knowledge of the virus and the disease it causes. Next, to develop new point-of-care diagnostics. Next, to characterize and test therapeutics. And finally, to develop safe and effective vaccines. First, with regard to diagnostics. As you probably heard from Dr. Francis Collins last Thursday, the NIH has developed a rapid acceleration of diagnostics program called RADx, with an award to that specific program up to $500 million to support the development of COVID-19 diagnostics. It is a national call for innovative technologies that will be evaluated in a Shark Tank-like selection process to get to either success or failure rapidly. Moving on to therapeutics, I'll talk a bit about the remdesivir success antiviral in a moment, but let me emphasize that there are a number of broad-spectrum antivirals that are in various stages of testing. In addition, we will be looking at convalescent plasma, which is plasma from individuals who've recovered from COVID-19, to be used in passive transfer, either in prevention or treatment. In addition, hyperimmune globulin, which can be used as a gamma globulin shot. We'll be looking at repurposed drugs, as well as immune-based therapies and host modifiers, and finally, monoclonal antibodies. Let me take a moment to describe the remdesivir placebo-controlled randomized trial, which was done internationally with a power of more than 1,000 individuals in sites throughout the world. It was in hospitalized patients with lung disease. The endpoint was primarily time to recovery. The result was statistically significant, but really modest. And we must remember, it was only a modest result, showing that the drug made a 31% faster time to recovery. We hope to build on this modest success with combinations of drugs and better drugs. Moving on to vaccines. There are at least 8 candidate COVID-19 vaccines in clinical development. The NIH has been collaborating with a number of pharmaceutical companies at various stages of development. I will describe one very briefly, which is not the only one, but one that we have been involved in heavily developing with Moderna. It's a messenger RNA platform. You might recall in this committee that in January of this year, I said that it would take about 1 year to 18 months if we were successful in developing a vaccine. The NIH trial moved very quickly. On January 10th, the sequence was known. On January the 11th, the Vaccine Research Center met to develop a plan. On the 14th of January, we officially started the vaccine development. 62 days later, we are now in phase 1 clinical trial with the 2 doses already fully enrolled. There will be animal safety. The phase 1 will directly go into phase 2-3 in late spring and early summer. And if we are successful, we hope to know that in the late fall and early winter. There are some important issues, however, in COVID-19 vaccine development. We have many candidates and hope to have multiple winners. In other words, it's multiple shots on goal. This will be important because this will be good for global availability if we have more than one successful candidate. We also, as the chairman mentioned, will be producing vaccine at risk, which means we'll be investigating considerable resources in developing doses even before we know any given candidate or candidates work. I must warn that there's also the possibility of negative consequences, where certain vaccines can actually enhance the negative effect of the infection. The big unknown is efficacy. Will it be present or absent, and how durable will it be? And finally, I want to mention the NIH has launched a public-private partnership called Accelerating COVID-19 Therapeutic Interventions and Vaccines. The purpose of that is to prioritize and accelerate clinical evaluation of therapeutic candidates with near-term potential. Hopefully, our research efforts, together with the other public health efforts, will get us quickly to an end to this terrible ordeal that we are all going through. Thank you very much. Happy to answer questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Fauci. Dr. Redfield, welcome.
Good morning, Chairman Alexander and Ranking Member Murray and members of the committee. Our nation is confronting the most serious public health crisis in more than a century. Yet we're not defenseless. We have powerful tools to fight this enemy. We have tried and true effective public health interventions, such as early case identification, isolation, and contact tracing, combined with important mitigation strategies, include social distancing, frequent hand washing, and face covering. These public health tools have and will continue to slow the spread of COVID-19. I appreciate the opportunity this morning to provide a brief overview of some of CDC's ongoing work in response to COVID-19. CDC has been working 24/7 to combat the pandemic. CDC's Emergency Operations Center is supporting state, tribal, local, and territorial public health partners in building core capabilities, particularly workforce, laboratory, and data and predictive analytics. Epidemiologists are conducting surveillance for COVID-19 as well as conducting health system surveillance. Community mitigation teams are providing guidance on infection control and contact tracing, and our laboratory experts are performing serological testing to better define the extent of asymptomatic populations. As local leadership makes decisions to reopen, they'll require varying degrees of federal support. Each location will be different and will face unique circumstances. CDC has conducted a state-by-state assessment of public health testing capacity and key contact tracing capacity, as well as surge plans. CDC is providing technical assistance and funding to the states provided through the Supplemental CARES Act and the Paycheck Protection Program and Healthcare Enhancement Act. We're working directly with the state public health leaders to define their needs for testing and testing devices, supplies, and manpower, surveillance, data collection and reporting, contact tracing, infection control, and outbreak investigation. I want to spend a moment to focus on several key elements. First, testing. Rapid, extensive, and widely available timely testing is essential for reopening America. CDC's role in testing continues to support diagnosis and contact tracing, surveillance, and outbreak. And we work with the public health partners to define their particular testing strategy for their jurisdiction. Admiral Giroir will address the testing components of the response in greater detail. Contact tracing. Increasing state, tribal, local, and territorial contact tracing capacity is critical. It's a critical part to stop the chains of transmission and prevent the occurrence of sustained community transmission. CDC's role is to provide technical training, assistance, and support to the states as they hire and build a workforce necessary to be fully prepared to effectively respond to the public health challenges posed by the ongoing COVID pandemic. This will be an expansive effort. Surveillance. Our nation's surveillance program is built on a combination of systems, including existing syndromic, influenza, and respiratory viral disease surveillance systems that have been combined with commercial and research lab platforms and our case reporting form system. CDC is adapting these and optimizing it to have a surveillance system in response to COVID-19. Importantly, in light of the significant occurrence of asymptomatic infection, the surveillance for asymptomatic infection becomes an important public health tool for early case identification. CDC is working with each public health jurisdiction to develop a prospective surveillance program to include active surveillance among those that are most vulnerable, such as individuals in long-term care facilities, inner-city clinics, and homeless shelters. We need to rebuild our nation's public health infrastructure. Data and data analytics, public health laboratory resilience, and our nation's public health workforce. Now's the time to put it in place for the generations to come, not only for the public health system that our nation needs, but for the public health system that our nation deserves. Before I close, I want to recognize the tireless commitment of the dedicated CDC staff who've deployed to every corner of this nation to fight COVID-19. More than 4,000 employees have deployed here and globally. Science and data continue with technical expertise and public source service to be the backbone of CDC's contributions to the U.S. response. I extend my serious gratitude to the healthcare workers in the front lines, as well as their family, and the essential emergency personnel, as well as the American people, to say thank you for adhering to the stay-at-home guidelines and protecting the most vulnerable. It's important to emphasize that we're not out of the woods yet. Battle contends and we must, but we are more prepared. We need to stay vigilant with social distancing. It remains an imperative. We are a resilient nation, and I am confident that we will emerge from this pandemic stronger together. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Redfield. Admiral Giroir, welcome.
Be here to provide you with an update on the nation's progress in testing for COVID-19. On March 12th, Secretary Azar requested that I lead the COVID-19 testing efforts within HHS, including oversight and coordination of the FDA and CDC with regard to testing. Since then, the nation has performed more than 9 million COVID-19 tests, a number far greater than any other country, and double the per capita tests performed to date in South Korea. To reach this point, we implemented a phased approach to meet testing needs during mitigation and now during phase 1 reopening of America. Beginning March 20th, we pioneered 41 community-based drive-through testing sites in locations prioritized by the CDC. These sites have been a profound success, testing over 167,000 high-risk individuals and demonstrating a prototype that is being duplicated multifold in nearly every state. Next, the administration leveraged trusted retailers, including CVS, Rite Aid, Walgreens, Walmart, Kroger, and Health Mart, who are now providing testing at 240 locations in 33 states, 69% of which are in communities with moderate to high social vulnerability. To meet the need for collection supplies, like swabs and media tubes, we first secured the global supply chain through a military air bridge. We worked directly with manufacturers to increase domestic production. We collaborated with the private sector and the FDA to validate multiple swab and media types that vastly expanded supplies while minimizing the need for PPE. Finally, we used Title III of the Defense Production Act to further invest in domestic manufacturing to prepare us for reopening. To support the need for surveillance testing during reopening, on April 27th, we issued a new testing framework that also prioritized testing for persons without symptoms who are prioritized by health departments or clinicians for any reason, including screening of asymptomatic individuals according to state and local plans. Next, our federal multidisciplinary team conducted multiple calls with leadership from each state to set state-specific testing objectives. Collectively, states and territories established an overall goal to perform 12.9 million tests over the next 4 weeks. The federal government is able to and will support the achievement of this goal. Specifically, the federal government is shipping to states 12.9 million swabs and over 9.7 million tubes of media in May alone. Last month, we also detailed the location and capacity of every lab machine in every state that could potentially run COVID-19 assays, and our team has worked with test suppliers to match reagents to these machines. Looking forward, between now and the end of 2020, the federal government will procure over 135 million swabs and 132 million tubes of media and distribute these to states as requested to supplement the now robust commercial supply. We anticipate marked increases in current tests, as well as a dramatic expansion of new point-of-care tests, like the first-in-class Quidel antigen test, authorized by the FDA just last Friday. Quidel anticipates being able to distribute 300,000 tests per day within just a few weeks. So by September, taking every aspect of development, authorization, manufacturing, and supply chain into consideration, we project that our nation will be capable of performing at least 40 to 50 million tests per month if needed at that time. And if new technologies are authorized, like whole genome sequencing approaches or any novel solutions uncovered by NIH's new diagnostics initiative, that number will be much higher. Finally, I want to acknowledge and express my heartfelt gratitude to the officers of the U.S. Public Health Service Commission Corps, the uniformed service I am honored to lead. 3,471 men and women have deployed in support of this pandemic, on the cruise ship in Japan, to our military bases repatriating Americans, to our community-based testing sites and international airports, to FEMA and our task forces, to nursing facilities, including King County, Washington, and to field hospitals and hard-hit communities across our nation. I thank each and every one of these officers and their families, and on their behalf, I thank the members of this committee for supporting our training needs and the establishment of a ready reserve to supplement our ranks in future national emergencies. Thank you for the opportunity to provide these remarks.
Thank you, Admiral Giroir. And now Dr. Stephen Hahn, our fourth and final witness.
Chairman Alexander, Ranking Member Murray, and members of the committee, thank you for inviting me to participate in this hearing today. I first want to start by thanking the American people for their incredible efforts at mitigation and extend my condolences to those who have lost loved ones. From day one of this pandemic, the 18,000 FDA employees, who are just incredible scientists, doctors, and nurses, have taken an active role in the all-of-government response to this pandemic. FDA has worked to facilitate the development of medical countermeasures to diagnose, treat, and prevent COVID-19. We've worked closely with laboratories, manufacturers, academia, product developers, our federal partners, and companies that don't even make medical products but want to pitch in, for example, by making hand sanitizer, personal protective equipment, and ventilators. Every decision we have made have been driven by data with the goal of protecting the health of the American people. In a public health emergency, however, our response has balanced the urgent need to make medical products available with the provision of a level of oversight that helps ensure the safety and effectiveness of those medical products. I'd like to take a few minutes to tell you what FDA is doing to help the country at this point, and which Americans judge is safe to return to work and to school. It starts with testing, as others have mentioned. FDA has worked with more than 500 developers who have or said they will be submitting emergency use authorization requests for COVID-19 tests. This includes some newer technologies that heretofore have not been used as part of diagnostic tests in response to a pandemic. We have issued 92 individual emergency use authorizations for test kit manufacturers and laboratories, and we've been informed by more than 250 laboratories they have begun testing under the regulatory flexibilities we outlined in March. We are conducting rolling reviews of EUA submissions so that we can quickly authorize tests in which the data support. In a public health emergency, the accuracy of diagnostic tests is important, not only for the individual patient, but for the patient at large, for the public at large. FDA is helping to ensure the availability of tests that are providing accurate answers. We are also monitoring the marketplace for fraudulent tests and are taking appropriate action to protect the public health. And we are working to provide more clarity about which tests have been reviewed and authorized by FDA and which have not. Serologic tests will play a role in our recovery. Unlike diagnostic tests, which detect the presence of the virus, serologic tests measure the amount of antibodies or protein present in the blood when the body is responding to an infection like COVID-19. These tests can help identify individuals who can overcome an infection and who have developed an immune response. We will continue working with labs, manufacturers, and across the government to find a balance between the assurance that an antibody test is accurate and timely access to such tests. Of course, the way we will eventually beat this virus is with a vaccine, and FDA is working closely with our federal partners, including the NIH, vaccine developers, manufacturers, and experts across the globe. We intend to use our regulatory flexibility to help ensure the most efficient development of a safe and effective vaccine to prevent COVID-19. Until a preventative vaccine is approved, however, we need medical products to bridge the gap. FDA has been working for several months to facilitate the development and availability of therapeutics as expeditiously as possible. And we've created an emergency program for this acceleration called the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program, or CTAP. We have reassigned staff to work with urgency to review requests from companies, scientists, doctors who are developing therapies, and we're using every available authority and regulatory flexibility that's appropriate to facilitate the development of safe and effective products to treat COVID-19. A variety of therapeutic areas are being evaluated, as mentioned by Dr. Fauci and others, including antiviral drugs and immunotherapies, as well as convalescent plasma, hyperimmune globulin, and monoclonal antibodies. As Dr. Fauci also mentioned, we recently announced the positive results of the NIAID trial of remdesivir and issued an EUA for the treatment of hospitalized patients with COVID-19. Two other promising treatments that I mentioned are the antibody-rich products, convalescent plasma and hyperimmune globulin, and I am certainly willing to go into more detail if members of this committee have questions about this. but we are working very aggressively and closely with stakeholders to facilitate the development of monoclonal antibodies, which, if shown to be safe and effective, could act as a bridge therapy to the development of a vaccine. We recognize that developing vaccines and therapies need to go hand in hand with ensuring that there will be sufficient supplies for our country. So we're also working with manufacturers to make sure that this supply chain is robust. Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member, and members of the committee, please know that in FDA, you have a dedicated team of some of the nation's finest scientists, healthcare providers, and public health professionals. We are guided by science and data, and we won't let up until we facilitate the development of products that our nation needs to get back to work. I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Dr. Hahn, and thanks to all four of you for your expertise, for your dedication to our country, and your hard work. We'll now begin a round of 5-minute questions from each senator on the committee, alternating between Republicans and Democrats. Each senator has, if you're by video conference, you have a little time clock at the bottom, and I would ask you to try to stay within 5 minutes for your questions and answers. I will start. I've got a question for Dr. Fauci and then Admiral Giroir. Doctor, let's look down the road 3 months. There will be about 5,000 campuses across the country trying to welcome 20 million college students, 100,000 public schools welcoming 50 million students. What would you say to the Chancellor of the University of Tennessee, Knoxville, or the president or the principal of a public school about how to persuade parents and students to return to school in August? Let's start with treatments and vaccines first, Dr. Fauci, and if you could save about half of my 5 minutes for Admiral Giroir for testing, I would appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Well, I would be very realistic with the Chancellor and tell him that when we're thinking in terms...
It's a her in this case.
Oh, okay, I would tell her, I'm sorry, sir, that in this case, that the idea of having treatments available or a vaccine to facilitate the reentry of students into the fall term would be something that would be a bit of a bridge too far. As I mentioned, the drug that has shown some degree of efficacy was modest, and it was in hospitalized patients, not yet or maybe ever to be used either yet as prophylaxis or treatment. So if the issue is that the young individuals who will be going back to school would like to have some comfort in that there's a treatment, probably the thing that would be closest to utilization then would likely be passive transfer of convalescent serum. But we're really not talking about necessarily treating a student who gets ill, but how the student will feel safe in going back to school. If this were a situation where we had a vaccine, that would really be the end of that issue in a positive way. But as I mentioned in my opening remarks, even at the top speed we're going, we don't see a vaccine playing in the ability of individuals to get back to school this term. What they really want is to know if they are safe. And that's the question that have to be due with what we discussed earlier about testing. So I'm about halfway through the remarks. I'd like to just pass the baton to Admiral Giroir, who would address the question of the availability of testing and what role that might play in returning to school. Thank you, sir.
Well, thank you, Doctor. Thank you, Dr. Fauci. And Admiral Giroir, you said that while we're doing about 10 million tests this month, that we might be as high as 40 or 50 million by September, and a month, which is a significant increase. So if I'm Chancellor of the University of Tennessee, could I develop a strategy where I'd say to all my students, we have, for example, an antigen test, which is quick and easy. You want everybody on campus to come by and take it once before you begin school. That will at least let everybody know that on that day we've isolated anybody who's positive, and then we can continue to monitor. Is that strategy possible in August and September?
So thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I may reserve 20 seconds for Dr. Redfield as well. The strategy that's going to be employed really depends heavily on what's the community spread at that time. If there's almost no community spread, your strategy will be different. If there's high community spread, it will also be different. But yes, technically, we will have the ability, and your chancellor will have the ability. We expect there to be 25 to 30 million point-of-care tests per month available. It is certainly possible to test all of the students, or it is much more likely that there would be a surveillance strategy done where you may test some of the students at different times to give an assurance that there's no circulation. That would be done in conjunction with the CDC and the local health department. There's also strategies that are still needing to be validated, but of pooling samples. We know in some experimental labs as many as 10 or 20 samples can be pooled, so essentially one test could test 20 students. And finally, there are some experimental approaches that look interesting, if not promising, that, for example, wastewater from an entire dorm or an entire segment of a campus could be tested to determine whether there's coronavirus in that sewerage, the wastewater. So there are other strategies being developed, and I'd like to at least give 20 seconds to Dr. Redfield, who really will be working on the strategy of how to employ the test given different community spread.
Dr. Redfield?
Yeah, just some quick comments, sir. I mean, first, I think it's really important to evaluate critically the role of changes in social distancing on college campuses and schools and the situation, not to forget the importance of what we've learned. Clearly, also developing an aggressive program for wellness education, making sure people understand when they're symptomatic, they need to seek evaluation. I think you are going to have to look at the role of testing. I think there is going to be an important role of testing in this circumstances, and I think it will be individualized based on where these different schools are, how much infection is in it.
I'm going to wrap it up there so I can set a good example for the other senators with their 5 minutes. Senator Murray.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to all of our witnesses. Dr. Fauci, you have warned of needless suffering and death if we push to reopen too soon, but the president has actually been sending the opposite message. I want to ask you today, what is the most important message you have for communities and states that are reopening, even as our public health experts make it clear it's too soon? Tell us what the consequences are.
Thank you very much for that question, Senator Murray. As I've said many times publicly, what we have worked out is a guideline framework of how to safely open America again. And there are several checkpoints in that, with a gateway first of showing, depending on the dynamics of an outbreak in a particular region, state, city, or area, that would really determine the speed and the pace with which one does re-enter or reopen. So my word has been, and I've been very consistent in this, that I get concerned if you have a situation where the dynamics of an outbreak in an area are such that you are not seeing that gradual over 14-day decrease that would allow you to go to phase 1. And then if you pass the checkpoints of phase 1, go to phase 2 and phase 3. What I've expressed then and again is my concern that if some areas, cities, states, or what have you, jump over those various checkpoints and prematurely open up without having the capability of being able to respond effectively and efficiently, my concern is that we will start to see little spikes that might turn into outbreaks. So therefore, I have been being very clear in my message to try to the best extent possible to go by the guidelines, which have been very well thought out and very well delineated.
So if a community or a state or a region doesn't go by those guidelines and reopen, the consequences could be pretty dire, correct?
The consequences could be really serious, particularly, and this is something that I think we also should pay attention to, that states, even if they're doing it at an appropriate pace, which many of them are and will, namely a pace that's commensurate with the dynamics of the outbreak, that they have in place already the capability that when there will be cases, there is no doubt, even under the best of circumstances, when you pull back on mitigation, you will see some cases appear. It's the ability and the capability of responding to those cases with good identification, isolation, and contact tracing will determine whether you can continue to go forward as you try to reopen America. So it's not only doing it at the appropriate time with the appropriate constraints, but having in place the capability of responding when the inevitable return of infections occur.
Well, thank you for that. And it's very clear in order to do that, we need knowledge, which is about testing. And for months, this administration's approach to testing has really been plagued by unrealized goals and disregard for systemic problems within that supply chain. And last week, an average of just 250,000 tests per day were performed in the United States. That is a small fraction of what we need. And yesterday, President Trump had the gall to declare the U.S. had, quote, prevailed on testing in a press conference that was filled with misinformation and distortions. Dr. Giroir, public health experts do not think the U.S. has prevailed. I'm glad you finally committed that states, including my home state of Washington, will receive enough tests to meet their goals for May and June. But this administration has had a record of giving us broken promises that more tests and supplies are coming, and they don't. And we know, by the way, that testing is needs will persist long past June, long past. So I wanted to ask you today, will the administration's forthcoming strategic plan that is now required under the COVID package that was just passed and signed into law, will that strategic plan on testing include specific numeric targets for testing capacity, supply chain capacity, and projection of shortages?
Thank you for that question and statement, Senator Murray. Yes, we are, as I've stated, we continue to have a work in progress as we build the testing capacity. We have established the targets with the states of over 12 million tests over the next 4 weeks. We think those targets are going to be good in May and June. But as Dr. Fauci said, we really have to be evidence-based. We expect those targets to go up as we progressively open, as communities go through phase 1 and then into phase 2. And certainly those numbers will need to go up significantly again in the fall when we potentially have influenza circulating with COVID. So yes, there will be targets. The targets will need to change based on the evidence that we see, but we are highly committed to securing the supply chain. We've worked daily with every manufacturer, and I'm just pleased we're in May and June able to get ahead of the states so that we can supply them what they need so they have those assurances. So there's not going to be any doubts about that.
My question to you is, when you put out that specific plan that you were required to do, we will see numbers that you are going to tell us that you will reach, targeted for testing and supply chain capacity and protection of sorts. Instead of just saying we hope to have 1 million this week, next week, so you will give us the specific targets, correct?
We know specific. I'll say yes, ma'am. We know the specific. We know the specific amounts of tests we have over the summer.
How many we need?
So, yes, ma'am. We developed the need statements by working with the states individually, with epidemiologists, with the CDC, so that overall in May we'll be testing about 3.9% of the overall U.S. population.
But what I'm telling you,
well over time, Senator Murray,
how many we have, but how many we will need, not just for May, but in the coming months, so that we can be prepared to have them.
Yes, ma'am, and not to be repetitive, but we need to be evidence and data driven, because what we may see in May or June will drive differences in the amount of test goals we have. So we really just need to be very humble about this. We need to look at the data. We know that the testing needs will go up over May and June as we progressively open, and we will do our best to predict that, but you have to understand we have to see what the data and the evidence show at that time.
Okay, I appreciate that. Mr. Chairman, again, what our strategic plan requires is what is the goal, not how many we have, but how many we need, and that's what we'll be looking for. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Murray. Senator Enzi.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I particularly appreciated your opening statement where you had a very succinct list of preparations we need to learn from this pandemic for the next one. Not only should we be working on this and preparing, but we need to look at the future too. And I think we've learned a lot. We're fighting a virus at the same time that scientists are learning about it. So we need to be nimble. We also need to be sure that we are prepared for a second wave of outbreaks that could coincide with the start of the flu season, potentially stressing our healthcare system even more than it already has been. Admiral Giroir, I thank you for your comments. I think they've been comforting about what has been done and what can be done. I agree with Senator Murray that we need to have some specific goals. As an accountant, that's always one of the things that I'm looking for. For questions, Dr. Hahn, our understanding of the clinical picture of COVID-19 continues to evolve. What first looked like a respiratory illness now seems much more comprehensive, potentially affecting the heart, the brain, the kidneys, and other organs. How does this evolving picture impact the ability to evaluate the appropriate clinical or surrogate endpoints for review of vaccines and treatment?
Thank you, Senator, for that question. The evolving clinical picture and obviously the way this is manifesting around the country clinically does in fact inform the endpoints that we will work with developers of therapies on so that we can get the absolute most efficient but also the most accurate information and appropriate endpoints to make the necessary authorizations and approvals. We have set up this program called the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program, where our top scientists and clinicians have been at the table consulting with our colleagues at NIH and CDC to actually address those questions. What are the appropriate endpoints? I'll give you an example. We do know that in some circumstances, patients who've had severe COVID disease have developed thrombotic or clotting type episodes. And so we prioritize a review of agents that we think might be beneficial. And obviously the clinical endpoints for those trials will be different than an agent that's an antiviral like remdesivir, whereas Dr. Fauci mentioned we're looking at time to recovery. So we want to adapt it to the clinical circumstance as well as to the type of therapy that's put before us.
Thank you. Another question to Dr. Hahn. We have made a lot of progress in vaccine development already, but BARDA has identified that domestic manufacturing of needles and syringes is a significant gap in pandemic preparedness. What has HHS done in advance of a potential national vaccination campaign to ensure that we have sufficient capacity to administer a vaccine?
Senator Enzi, thank you for that question. This is a really important point because, as you mentioned, it's not just about the vaccine or hopefully vaccines that are developed. It's all about it's also about the supplies that are needed as well as an operational plan for administering the vaccine. So this is an all-of-government approach. There is a program that's been set up called Operation Warp Speed that includes Dr. Collins, Dr. Fauci, his colleagues at NIH, the Department of Defense, as well as other members of HHS and FDA. Dr. Peter Marks from our Center for Biological Evaluation Research has been helping coordinate that, is working very closely with Dr. Fauci and his team. And we've created what's called a Gantt chart to look forward. What are the necessary supply chain issues, syringes, needles, et cetera, depending on the various vaccines that are being developed, how many times they have to administer, and the route of administration. So we've been leaning in on this supply chain to ensure that when a vaccine is ready to go, we will have the necessary supplies to actually administer it and operationalize the vaccination.
Thank you. I have a couple more questions, but again, the clock's not visible there, so I suspect I've used up my time. I'll submit those in writing.
Thank you, Senator Enzi. Senator Sanders.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. And let me thank all of the panelists for the hard work they're doing and for being with us today. It is sad to say that we have a president of the United States, the leader of our country, who from day one downplayed the dangers facing this country from the pandemic, who told us that the crisis would be over in a few months, that we did not have to worry, who fired those members of the government who wanted to act aggressively and, among other things, at a time when we need international cooperation, cut funding for the World Health Organization. But let me also say that I think we understand that facts are terribly important. Not everybody, that we don't fully understand all of the ramifications of the COVID-19 epidemic. But let me ask Dr. Fauci a few questions, if I might. For a start, the official statistic, Dr. Fauci, is that 80,000 Americans have died from the pandemic. There are some epidemiologists who suggest the number may be 50% higher than that. What do you think?
I'm not sure, Senator Sanders, if it's going to be 50% higher, but most of us feel that the number of deaths are likely higher than that number because given the situation, particularly in New York City, when they were really strapped with a very serious challenge to their healthcare system, that there may have been people who died at home who did have COVID, who were not counted as COVID because they never really got to the hospital. So in direct answer to your question, I think you are correct that the number is likely higher. I don't know exactly what percent higher, but almost certainly it's higher.
Dr. Fauci, let me ask you this. In the terrible pandemic of 1918, the virus exploded in the fall. It came back with a vengeance. Are we fearful that if we don't get our act together, as bad as the situation is now, it could become worse in the fall or winter?
Well, Senator, thank you for that question. It's a frequently asked question, and I think that possibility does exist. However, and the reason I say that is that when you talk about will this virus just disappear, and as I've said publicly many times, that is just not going to happen because it's such a highly transmissible virus. And even if we get better control over the summer months, it is likely that there will be virus somewhere on this planet that will eventually get back to us. So my approach towards the possibility of a rebound and a second wave in the fall is that A, it's entirely conceivable and possible that it would happen, but B, I would hope that between now and then, given the capability of doing the testing that you've heard from Admiral Giroir and the ability of us to stock up on personal protective equipment and the workforce that the CDC under Dr. Redfield will be putting forth to be able to identify, isolate, and contact trace, I hope that if we do have the threat of a second wave, we will be able to deal with it very effectively to prevent it from becoming an outbreak, not only worse than now, but much, much less.
Okay, let me ask, we've heard a lot of discussion about vaccines. Obviously, everybody in Congress and in this country wants a vaccine. We want it as quickly as possible, as effective as possible. Let me ask the Honorable FDA Commissioner, sir, if, God willing, a vaccine is developed, and if we're able to produce it as quickly as we all hope we can, I would imagine that that vaccine would be distributed to all people free of charge, or make sure at least that everybody in America who needs that vaccine will get it, regardless of their income. Is that a fair assumption?
Senator, I certainly hope so. FDA is very committed to making sure that all populations in the United States, including those most vulnerable, are included in the clinical trials. And
well, that's not what I'm asking. What I'm asking is, if and when the vaccine comes, it won't do somebody any good if they don't get it. And if they have to pay a sum of money for it in order to profit the drug companies, that will not be helpful. Are you guaranteeing the American people today that that vaccine will be available to all people, regardless of their income?
Sir, the payment of vaccines is not a responsibility of FDA, but I'm glad to take this back to the task force. I share your concern that this needs to be made available to every American.
Does anybody else want to comment on that? Mr. Giroir, do you think we should make that vaccine, when hopefully it is created, available to all, regardless of income? or do you think that poor people and working people should be last in line for the vaccine?
I'm sorry, Senator, were you asking me?
Yes, I was, sir. Yes, I was.
No, my office is one of the offices committed to serving the underserved, and we need to be absolutely certain that if a vaccine or an effective therapeutic or preventive is available, that it reaches all segments of society, regardless of their ability to pay or any other social determinants of health that there may be.
Good. So when you're telling the American people today that regardless of income, every American will be able to gain access to that vaccine when it comes?
They should gain access to it. I don't control, I think
you represent an administration that makes that decision.
I will certainly advocate that everyone is able to receive the vaccine regardless of income or any other circumstance.
Let me just switch gears.
Senator Sanders.
All right, I'm sorry. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Those are important questions. I don't want to cut senators off, and it's hard to see the time clock.
Watching this hearing of the Health, Education, Labor, and Pension Committee of the U.S. Senate, an unusual one, just that picture speaks volumes right there. Only a handful of senators actually in the room. Others, along with the key witnesses, 4 leaders of our health system, all appearing remotely because of obviously the concerns, the general concerns, in a few cases, concerns that they may themselves have been exposed to the coronavirus. Also, this is the first chance for many of these experts to speak free of the White House, speak directly to members of the Senate who continue to hone down on issues of testing and also the risk of communities across the country opening potentially prematurely. And we heard Dr. Fauci mention that inevitably when you begin to open up society, we will see more cases. His concern is that many communities may not be prepared for those consequences. This will go on for another couple of hours, but we want to bring in right now Casey Hunt, who's been watching this for us. Casey, what is the significance of this hearing and what happens after?
Well, Lester, I think that what you've seen is an event that is focused on facts, the realities of testing, the realities of reopening in a way that, is much different than what we have been seeing daily throughout this crisis at the White House, where we have seen quite a bit of politicking and not necessarily the same set of facts from the president as what we're hearing from these officials today. Dr. Fauci, of course, testifying that he thought it would be a bridge too far to think that we would have a vaccine in time for fall semesters. He was answering a question from Lamar Alexander, the chairman, about how universities could prepare for this. He also said that he was concerned that if we open up too quickly in response to Senator Murray, that we would start to see little spikes, outbreaks that potentially could turn into something bigger. So he was pretty measured and cautious in his responses here. As Democrats have been urging him not to pull any punches, he hasn't been going after his boss, going after the president, but he has been presenting a pretty straightforward picture of a very dire situation across the country. One thing that stood out to me as well, Lester, is that he acknowledged that it's likely that the count of the number of deaths in this country is not actually taking into account everyone who has been affected by this. He talked particularly about New York City and reports of people who were dying in their homes that are likely not part of the official coronavirus death tally. So very much both from a factual perspective and also from an optics and reality of how this hearing had to play out perspective, yes, we're talking about attempting to reopen the country, but there are so many signs here of how the ways in which we are not. The fact that they are self-quarantining, they are not here in person. There are very few senators in the hearing room. This campus here on Capitol Hill all but deserted, a very strange sort of scene, all underscoring that we are still very much in the middle of this. Lester.
Yeah, it's as if we're all right now living in these little video boxes and certainly spreading to the U.S. Senate. Casey, thank you. And then there, of course, is the contrast in what we heard from Dr. Fauci and what we've been hearing from the White House as recently as yesterday, as the president trumpeted, ramped up testing, even as we heard in this hearing a moment ago from Senator Lamar Alexander, that there is not enough testing to get to where we need to be. Let's go to Jeff Bannard. He is at the White House right now. Jeff, what's the read from that end of Pennsylvania evidence?
Hey, Lester, I think I'd like to underscore and amplify a point you made in that this is rare testimony and that this is the first time the country is hearing from the nation's top 4 health officials who are charged with the federal coronavirus response in an unfiltered manner, away from the close and careful gaze of President Trump, who at times during previous coronavirus task force briefings has either, cut off or redirected some of these answers. But a couple of headlines here, because there was this point of bipartisan agreement on the testing front. As you mentioned, Lamar Alexander, the Republican of Tennessee who chairs this committee, said what our country has done so far on testing is impressive, he said, but not nearly enough. We also heard from the top Democrat, Patty Murray of Washington. She said we need dramatically more testing. It's unacceptable we don't have a national strategic plan to make sure testing is fast, free, and everywhere. So that stands in stark contrast to what President Trump told me yesterday in the Rose Garden. He says this country has prevailed on testing. Another quick thing we heard from Admiral Giroir, who leads the federal coronavirus testing response. He says by September, he projects the nation will be capable of performing roughly 40 to 50 million tests per month. So put in a different way, that means that President Trump's statement, he said this a couple of months ago, that every American who wants a test can get a test, that, according to Giroir, will be true by September or October, he says.
All right, Jeff Bennett, thank you very much. I want to bring in Dr. John Torres. And John, one of the issues that I think Dr. Fauci was stressing is that there will be inevitably more cases as you begin to open up society, and he was concerned about the ability to respond to the consequences. If you recall, it was just over a month ago that New York was seeing its peak. I think at one point, it was close to 900 deaths a day, and the healthcare system here was strained potentially to the breaking point. Is the concern that we may hear those calls once again for ventilators and PPE in some of these communities that haven't been hit yet?
And Lester, that's the big concern, because what he said is we know these cases are going to go up. It's just a matter of keeping it under control. Isolating, testing, contact tracing, those are all important to have in place. And his concern is some communities might have met some of the statistics as far as the 14-day decline, but they might not have those other things in place. So when they do start seeing these outbreaks, they can't control them as well. That's his big worry, that they make sure they do. Otherwise, we start getting back to where we were, get back to square one, something none of us really want to do, Lester.
All right, thanks, Doctor. Let me bring in the moderator of Meet the Press, Chuck Todd. Chuck, as we noted, this was a different tone in this hearing than what we heard from the White House, even members, Republican members expressing concerns about the level of testing. Where does this go from here in terms of support for the president, even from within his own party?
Well, look, one of the things I want to point out is that this is probably among the most functional committees on a bipartisan basis. The Senate Intel has always been one of those, and Senate Help is this nickname, the Health Committee is nicknamed. A lot of that is largely due to Lamar Alexander and Patty Murray, the two leading senators of this committee, because they do a good job working together. They have sort of some shared health priorities in general. They may be ideologically opposed, but philosophically they're close. So I would just say, I'm listening to this hearing, and on one hand, you're very encouraged because you realize everybody's dealing with the same set of facts, whether it's a Republican asking the question or a Democrat. And I think this is a reminder that in some ways, Lester, and as uncomfortable as it is to say it, President Trump his presence seems to create more chaos, create more issues in a given moment, take him out of the equation, and you have a sort of a clear, I would say, tough picture that we're facing. We need a lot more testing. I want to pick up on a point Jeff Bennett said. He said eventually the Admiral said we're going to have enough tests for everybody by September. What I've learned from this hearing from Lamar Alexander was we have to have a test for everybody by September, or we're not opening anything up, whether it's the University of Tennessee, my kids' middle school, or 30 Rock. So we've got a ways to go, and I will say this, part of me is oddly encouraged by watching this group of senators work together. This is probably the more high-functioning bipartisan group you're going to have of a committee these days.
All right, Chuck Todd, Chuck, good to see you. We are going to return now to regular programming, but coverage of today's hearing continues on our streaming service, NBC News Now, and I'll be back with a complete wrap-up when I see you on NBC Nightly News. For now, I'm Lester Holt, NBC News in New York. Good day, everyone.
Kisqali plus fulvestrant helped women live